Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
Welcome to the Reading Theatre, comrades, Dung Moose. We're reading from Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend, Chapter 2. I believe this is the third time we will be reading from Chapter 2. Maybe the last? Chapter 2 is a biggin. It was a biggin. But this part of Chapter 2 is called Infiltration, Disinformation, and Calls for Insurrection. If you need a link to the work and you're watching me right now live on Kick, because Twitch banned me for having hammer and sickle bit badges, yeah, you can click on the link at the top of my Kick screen right here. I just have it pinned for you all. And if you aren't watching me on Kick yet, come on over. I'm including the links to all my Kick in all my YouTube videos now, so look for it in the description. Alright, infiltration, disinformation, and calls for insurrection. Do the rules of conspiracy, theorized by Trotsky, invoke only the concealment of one's political identity? Or can they include the use of false denunciations, so as to sow confusion and chaos in the enemy camp, and make it even more difficult to detect the clandestine network fighting for the overthrow of the Stalin regime? In other words, are the conspiracy rules only about the strict protection of confidential information, or are they also about giving the green light to disinformation? It is not just the American journalist Anne Louise Strong, who was sympathetic to the USSR government, who held such suspicions. It is the secret speech itself that speaks of false reports and of provocations carried out by both the real Trotskyites, who thus took their revenge, and by conscienceless careerists inclined to make their way even by the most despicable means. A significant episode occurred at the time of the announcement of Kirov's assassination. The prevailing feelings, Andrew Smith, who was working at that time in the Elkstravod factory in Kuznetsov, reports were shock and anguish for the future. But there were also those who expressed regret that it was not Stalin who was hit. An assembly was then held, during which the workers were invited to denounce the enemies or possible enemies of Soviet power. This is from Flores, 1990. Quote, Smith recalled in amazement how, in the course of the debate, the group of dissenters with whom he himself was in contact had been the most diligent in attacking opponents and deviationists and calling for the most severe measures against them. Unquote. Symptomatic is also an episode that takes place outside the USSR, but that can serve to understand what happens inside this country. When General Alexander M. Orlov, formerly a leading collaborator of the NKVD, and in 1938 a defector to the United States, was accused by the journalist Louise Fisher of having participated during the Spanish Civil War in the liquidation of anti-Stalinist communist cadres, he responded with the false revelation that his accuser was actually a spy in the service of Moscow. In the Soviet Union of the 30s, we have seen the opposition infiltrate the highest levels of the apparatus of repression. It would be very strange if, after having achieved this result, it had limited itself to carrying out Stalin's orders. Disinformation, which has the twofold advantage of hampering the machine of repression and of getting rid of some particularly hated enemies precisely through it, is an integral part of war. And this is what is now, judging at least from the intervention in July 1933 by Trotsky, who considers the counter-revolutionary civil war already in progress, quote unquote, unleashed by the Stalinist bureaucracy, and resulted in the base persecutions of the Bolshevik-Leninists to be going on right now. If you want to know where they get where Trotskyists get that history of calling themselves just Leninists, it's right there. Oh shit, thank you. What the heck, 2-ton? Thank you so much, comrade. Gifting 6 subs to the channel. Thank you, comrade. Thank you for unlocking candy for everybody after the politics. Appreciate your support. Thank you very much, comrade. Holy crap. Very much appreciated. Salute to you. And that means I'll save it till after the read, which is kind of nice about the kick, I guess. I will, as soon as we're done the read, I will do the Juche Gang song for everybody, okay? Oh, well, they won't let me sub with Cash App, but Cash App card, but I can gift subs. Well, thank you, comrade. I appreciate you going through the extra work of supporting the channel. Thank you, very much appreciated. Seriously, thank you very much. Y'all are fantastic. Thank you. Okay. So yeah, right here you see Trotsky calling themselves the Bolshevik Leninists, these ones who were, who were working to overthrow the USSR government and were persecuted for it. Calling them the Bolshevik Leninists. You see, this is where the tradition of Trotskyists calling themselves just Leninists comes from. It is then necessary to take note of the new situation. The slogan of the reform of the CPSU no longer makes sense. A frontal struggle is necessary. The party and the International, led by Stalin, by now at the end of their tether, quote, can give nothing to the world proletariat, absolutely nothing, except evil, unquote. On the opposite side, the authentic revolutionaries certainly could not be inspired in their action by the petty bourgeois pacifists. There is no doubt. The bureaucracy can be compelled to yield power into the hands of the proletarian vanguard only by force, unquote. Hitler's rise to power did not mean for Trotsky that unity was necessary in order to face the enormous danger looming from Germany, but rather that it was no longer possible to stop halfway in the struggle against a power, Stalinist power, which had led the German and international proletariat to defeat. So, whether, and this is why I've talked about before, whether or not Trotsky was actually a fifth column element that like worked for the Nazis or not, he did service for the Nazis ultimately. At this time when they were about to face like the German fascist onslaught that was building just over the horizon, Trotsky is attacking and trying to disunite the government for things that were going on during Trotsky's time as well. As we can see, it is the leader of the opposition himself who speaks of civil war within the party that had jointly directed the October Revolution and early Soviet Russia. We are in the presence of a category that constituted the guiding thread of the research of a Russian historian of sure and declared Trotskyist faith, the author of a monumental work in several volumes, dedicated precisely to the minute reconstruction of this civil war. He spoke, with regard to Soviet Russia, of preventative civil war unleashed by Stalin against those organizing to overthrow him. Even outside the USSR, this civil war manifested itself and at times flared up within the front fighting against Franco. And in fact, in reference to Spain in 1936-39, one speaks not of one, but of two civil wars. With great intellectual honesty, and taking advantage of the new, rich documentary material available thanks to the opening of the Russian archives, the author quoted here came to the following conclusion. Quote, "The Moscow trials were not an unmotivated and cold-blooded crime, but Stalin's reaction in the course of an acute political struggle." Unquote. Politicizing against Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who paints the victims of the purges as a collection of rabbits, the Russian Trotskyist historian reported a leaflet in the 1930s calling to sweep out of the Kremlin the fascist dictator and his clique. Then he comments, quote, "Even from the point of view of the Russian legislation in force today, this leaflet must be judged as a call for violent overthrow of power, more exactly of the ruling upper stratum." Unquote. In conclusion, far from being an expression of an excess of irrational and senseless violence, the bloody terror unleashed by Stalin is in fact the only way in which he succeeded in bending the resistance of true communist forces. The party of those to be shot is how targeted individuals were labeled. In analogy with the expression used to designate the French Communist Party, the principal force of anti-fascist resistance and the favorite target of Hitler's terror. Unquote. Stalin is thus compared to Hitler. Yet the fact remains that French communists and partisans did not limit themselves to passive or nonviolent resistance to the latter. Civil War and international maneuvers. It is not surprising that this or that great power from time to time sought to profit from the latent civil war in Soviet Russia. Sometimes it is a defeated group who, believing in no other chance of success, urge or want to provoke foreign intervention. This dialectic developed as early as the first months of Soviet Russia's existence. Let us return to the assassination attempt of July 6, 1918. It was an integral part of a very ambitious project. On the one hand, the left socialist revolutionaries promoted counter-revolutionary uprisings against the Soviet government in several centers, or even an insurrection in Moscow in the hope of overthrowing the communist government, unquote. On the other hand, they were also decided to assassinate several leading Germans in order to provoke a German military reaction and consequent resumption of the war. Jesus. Such an outcome would have been met by the Russian people's mass revolt, which would have inflicted a defeat at once to the government of traitors and the invading enemy. The protagonist of the attack on the German ambassador was a sincere revolutionary. Well before making contact with Trotskyist circles, he intended to emulate the Jacobins, protagonists of the most radical phase of the French Revolution, and of the heroic mass resistance against the invasion of the counter-revolutionary powers. In the eyes of the Soviet authorities, however, Blumkin could only be a provocateur. The success of his plan would have resulted in a new advance by Wilhelm II's army, and perhaps the collapse of the power born of the October Revolution. At every historical turning point, domestic and international politics get intertwined. Hitler's coming to power, with the annihilation or devastation of the strongest section of the Communist International, was a hard blow for the Soviet Union. How will it have weighed in on the balance of internal politics? On the 30th of March 1933, Trotsky, who blamed the USSR's ruling bureaucracy for the communist defeat in Germany, wrote that the liquidation of Stalin's regime is
absolutely inevitable and not very long in coming.
In the summer of that same year, in France, the Daladier government had granted Trotsky a visa. Only a few months had passed since he opposed Hero's previous rejection, so here one should wonder about the reasons for this change of mind. Ruth Fischer believes that the French government started from the assumption of a weakness in Stalin's position, of a gathering of the opposition against him, and of Trotsky's imminent return to Moscow in a leading executive position. Curious, huh? Like I said, whether he was an actual fifth columnist or not, you decide. A new dramatic turning point came with the outbreak of the Second World War. In the spring of 1940, the Soviet Union was still out of the gigantic clash. Indeed, it continued to be linked to Germany through the Non-Aggression Pact. It was an intolerable situation for countries already hit by Hitler's aggression, which, using the Russian-Finnish conflict as the pretext, grew up plans to bomb Baku's oil centers. It was not just a matter of striking at the Third Reich's energy supply line. The Franco-British war plans aimed to make the Soviet Union break its military alliance with Germany through attacks on the Caucasus oil industries and bring a post-Stalinist regime to their fold against Germany. Unquote. Who the fuck wrote that? 148. Hillgrubber. In 1991. Let us go back for a moment to the assassination attempt on the German ambassador Mirbach. The man in charge had certainly aimed to provoke Germany's attack, but not because he had hoped for its victory. On the contrary, he had hoped that the whiplash would have awakened Russia, leading it to a decisive redemption. Later, we saw Blumkin take part in the conspiracy directed by Trotsky, and the latter, in turn, in order to clarify his position, compared himself in 1927 to the French Prime Minister Clemenceau, who, during the First World War, took over the leadership of the country after denouncing the lack of his predecessor's war effort, and thus putting himself forward as the only statesman capable of leading France to the victory against Germany. From the mass of successive interpretations and reinterpretations of this analogy, only one firm point has emerged. Not even the invasion of the Soviet Union would put an end to the opposition's attempt to seize power. Even more disturbing is the comparison already seen of Stalin with Nicholas II. Course of the First World War, read and denounced as an imperialist war, the Bolsheviks had launched a watchword of revolutionary defeatism and had identified the Tsarist autocracy and the internal enemy as the main enemy, the one that in the first place they had to fight and defeat. Something, by the way, our communists in Canada today have forgotten, with the threats coming from Donald Trump against Canada and annexation, which, as again, I remind people, would be totally voluntary on the end of our Canadian bourgeoisie. No doubt in my mind. If it were to go forward. That is. In the years that followed, Trotsky went far beyond evoking the spirit of Clemenceau. On 22nd of April 1939, he spoke out for
freeing the so-called Soviet Ukraine from the Stalinist boot.
Once independent, it would then unite with Western Ukraine, to be wrested from Poland, and with Carpathian Ukraine, annexed shortly before by Hungary. Let us reflect on the timing of this stance. The Third Reich had just completed the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, and rumors began to grow that the Soviet Union, and in particular the Ukraine, was Germany's next target. Under these circumstances, in July 1939, even Kerensky had taken a stand against Trotsky's wondrous project, which, the Menshevik leader observed, only favored Hitler's policy, as I pointed out earlier. Quote, "The same opinion is held also by the Kremlin," Trotsky promptly retorted, who, on the other hand, had already written in the 22nd April article that with the independence of the Ukraine, quote,
"The Bonapartist clique in Moscow will reap what it has sown." Better that the present Bonapartist caste is undermined, upset, crushed, and swept away. Only this way could the road be paved for a genuine defense of the Soviet Republic and its socialist future.
Immediately after the start of the invasion of Poland, Trotsky went even further. In predicting the final ruin of the Third Reich, he adds, "On the road to the abyss, Hitler can not only crush Poland, but he can give the Soviet Union such blows as to cost the Kremlin oligarchy their heads." Like, is it just me or does it sound like he's cheering on the Nazis here? This prediction, or this wish, for a liquidation, even physical, of the clique or Bonapartist caste by a revolution from below or even by a military invasion could not fail to appear to Stalin's eyes as the confirmation of his suspicions about the at least objective convergence between the Nazi leadership and the Trotskyist opposition. Both had an interest in provoking the USSR's collapse from within, even if the former saw in this collapse the prerequisite to the Slavic country enslavement, and the latter the unleashing of a new revolution. Nor was this a particularly damning suspicion. Posing as a new Lenin, Trotsky aspired to use to his advantage the dialectical process that had led to the defeat of the Russian army, the collapse of the Tsarist autocracy, and the victory of the October Revolution. Once again, the history behind Bolshevism had backfired on Soviet power. Kerensky, who in 1917 had denounced the Bolsheviks' treachery, now warned against the treachery of self-identified Bolshevik Leninists, quote unquote. From Stalin's point of view, there had been a radical change since the First World War. He was now dealing with a political party or faction which, at least as far as the initial phase of the conflict was concerned, took into account the collapse of the country resulting from the October Revolution and the military triumph of the German not already worn down by 3 years of war, as was that of Wilhelm II, but in the fullness of its power and explicitly committed to building its colonial empire in the East. Given these assumptions, the emergence of the charge of treason is hardly surprising. Let us return to Trotsky's article of 22nd of April 1939. In it, there is only one statement that may have met with Stalin's approval. Quote,
"The impending war will create a favorable atmosphere for all sorts of adventurers, miracle hunters, and seekers of the golden fleece."
Unquote. As the flames of the Second World War raged further, destined to extend to the Soviet Union as well, as Trotsky himself predicted, Trotsky continued to make statements and assertions that were anything but reassuring. Let us see some of them.
"Soviet patriotism is inseparable from the irreconcilable struggle against the Stalinist clique."
June 18th, 1940.
"The Fourth International, long ago, recognized the necessity of overthrowing bureaucracy and power in Russia by means of revolutionary uprising of the toilers."
The 25th of September, 1939.
The Stalinist bureaucracy has thus become the main source of war danger to the Soviet Union.
April 13th, 1940. It is well understandable that, branded as the main enemy, the bureaucracy, or rather the oligarchy, in power, became convinced that the opposition, if not in the direct service of the enemy, was nevertheless ready, at least at first, to go along with its action. Any government would have identified organizations thus oriented as a threat to national security. Stalin's worries and suspicions were heightened by the prediction, which Trotsky indulged in on the 25th of September 1939, of a
approaching revolution in the USSR.
The Stalinist bureaucracy had
just a few years or even a few months prior to its inglorious downfall.
Where did this certainty come from? Was it a forecast formulated by taking into account only the internal developments of the country? It was all the more difficult to decipher the interweaving of political conflicts within Soviet Russia and international tensions because the suspicions and accusations are further fueled by the substantial reality of a fifth column and the disinformation operations carried out by Hitler's German Secret Service. In April 1938, Goebbels noted in his diary, quote, "Our clandestine radio transmitter from East Prussia to Russia is causing a great stir. It operates in the name of Trotsky and gives Stalin a hard time." Unquote. Goebbels said that. Immediately after the unleashing of Operation Barbarossa, the head of the propaganda service of the Third Reich was even more satisfied. Quote, "We are now working with 3 underground radio stations for Russia. The first is Trotskyist, the second is separatist, the third is Russian nationalist. All 3 of them harsh against the Stalinist regime." Unquote. It is an instrument to which the aggressors attach great importance. Quote, "We work with every means, especially with the 3 clandestine radios for Russia. They are a model of astuteness and sophistication." Unquote. On the role of Trotskyist propaganda, Goebbels' diary notes of 14th of July is particularly significant. After reporting on the treaty between the Soviet Union and Britain and the joint communique of the 2 countries, the note continued as follows. Quote, "This is a welcome opportunity for us to demonstrate the compatibility between capitalism and Bolshevism, here synonymous with the official Soviet power. The statements will encounter little favor among the circles of Leninists in Russia. Keep in mind that the Trotskyists like to define themselves as the Bolshevik Leninists, as opposed to the Stalinists, who were considered traitors to Leninism." That's why they call themselves that. Yeah. They just say Leninist. That's your first red flag if they don't want to use Trotskyist. They don't outright call themselves Trotskyists and they keep saying, "I'm a Leninist. I'm a Leninist." That's a red flag. If they're not saying Marxist-Leninist, you got yourself a red flag probably. Just to let you know. Yeah, never trust the Trots though. Rule number 1. And the liberals. They're the same thing. Naturally, Stalin and his collaborators' en bloc condemnation of the opposition as a den of enemy spies seems grotesque today, but one must not lose sight of the historical picture summarily outlined here. Above all, it is necessary to keep in mind that similar suspicions and accusations in the opposite direction were being formulated against the Stalin leadership. After branding Stalin a fascist dictator, the leaflets that the Trotskyist network circulated in the Soviet Union added, "The Politburo leaders are either mentally ill or mercenaries of fascism," quote unquote. Even in official opposition documents, it was insinuated that Stalin might be the protagonist of a gigantic international provocation, quote unquote. So feeding into imperialist propaganda directly. On one side and the other, rather than engage in the laborious analysis of the objective contradictions and opposing options and the political conflicts that developed on this basis, one preferred to resort hastily to the category of treason, and in its extreme configuration, the traitor became the conscious and valuable agent of the enemy. Trotsky never tired of denouncing the
conspiracy of the Kremlin bureaucracy against the working class.
And the plot is all the more despicable for the fact that the
Stalinist bureaucracy
was nothing more than a
transmissive mechanism of imperialism.
It is hardly necessary to say that Trotsky was generously repaid in the same coin. He complained of being branded as an agent of this and that power, but in turn labeled Stalin
an agent provocateur in the service of Hitler.
But Trotsky wanted Hitler to invade the Soviet Union and defeat the leadership. I don't know. It seems strange to me. The most hateful accusations are leveled by both sides. On closer inspection, the most fanciful were those coming from the opposition. The contradictory and tormented state of mind of its leaders has been finally analyzed by a Russian historian, hardly susceptible of Stalinist sympathies. Quote, "Trotsky wanted not the defeat of the Soviet Union, but the collapse of Stalin. In his prophecies about the impending war, there is a sense of insecurity. The exile knew that only a defeat of his homeland could put an end to Stalin's power. A defeat to the fascists, this he wanted. He desired war, because in this war, he saw the only possibility of overthrowing Stalin. But Trotsky did not want to admit this, even to himself." Unquote. Yeah. Trotsky's stupid like that, IHI. between Bonapartist overthrow, coup d'etat, and disinformation. The Tucholsky case. The affair that led to the 1937 indictment and execution of Marshal Tucholsky and of numerous other leading members of the Red Army must be understood in this context of civil war, latent or manifest, within the new ruling group that had emerged from the collapse of the ancient regime, of mutual accusations of treason and collusion with the imperialist enemy, and of the real activity of the secret services in recruiting agents and in deception. There is a long prehistory behind this affair. Lenin already saw a Bonapartist danger looming over Soviet Russia and expressed his worries about it to Trotsky as well. Could civilian power really succeed in being obeyed by the military? In 1920, Tucholsky seemed to want to sovereignly decide the victorious march on Warsaw that he dreamed of. In any case, leading historians observe today a tendency for the brilliant general who might very well have become the Bonaparte of the Bolshevik Revolution, the fuck, quote unquote, clearly emerged. 10 years later, Stalin was warned by the GPU about plots that were being woven against him in military circles. Was it mere fabrication? In April of the following year, serious doubts about Tucholsky were formulated by Trotsky, who made this analysis of the situation in the USSR following the political defeat of Bakurin and the right wing connected with him. Now, the main danger for socialism was not represented by the Thermidorian overthrow, which formally preserved the Soviet character of the country and the communist character of the party in power, but by the Bonapartist overthrow, which takes a more open, riper form of the bourgeois counter-revolution carried out against the Soviet system and the Bolshevik Party as a whole, in the form of the naked sword raised in the name of bourgeois property, unquote. In that case, the adventurous praetorian elements of the type of Tucholsky could play a major role. Countering them with arms in hand would be the revolutionary elements of the party, the state, and, note well, the army, gathered around the working class and the faction of Bolshevik Leninists, i.e. Trotskyists. This stance represented a new element in the conflict between the Bolsheviks. While keeping the armed forces under his control, Stalin also took care not to invoke them too closely in all the controversies and intrigues which shook the party and state. Now clearly the opposition sought to set foot or consolidate its presence in the army, in the name of the struggle against the Bonapartist danger, which only it would be able to deal with in the consequential manner. And yet, without allowing himself to be impressed by the Bonapartist danger thus evoked, in 1936, Stalin elevated Tucholsky and 4 other military leaders to the rank of marshal. It was a promotion decided in the context of a reform that saw the army abandoned from a predominantly territorial into a standing force, and restoring the old pre-revolutionary discipline, quote unquote. On December 21st of the same year, together with the other members of the Soviet Union and political and military leadership, the newly appointed marshal celebrated Stalin's victory at Stalin's home. Till 5:30 in the morning, points out Dimitrov. It was precisely this reform that aroused the indignation of Trotsky. On the one hand, he resumed the old accusation that the Red Army has not stood aside, however, from the procession of degeneration of the Soviet regime.
On the contrary, these have found their most finished expression in the army.
On the other hand, Trotsky adopted a new tone, mentioning the formation of something
in the nature of the oppositional faction within the army,
which, from the left, lamented the abandonment of the perspective of world revolution. Here we go. And the text quoted here in some way insinuates that to such opposition, Tukhachevsky himself could be attracted. Tukhachevsky, who in 1921 had even fought somewhat too imperatively for the formation of the internal general staff, could scarcely recognize himself in the abandonment of internationalism, and indeed in the deification of the status quo, which had by then taken over in the USSR. What can be said of this later text from Trotsky? Agitation in the army had continued apace, and it seemed to be growing stronger. Only now the struggle on the horizon saw not the faction of Bolshevik-Leninists pitted against the Bonapartist generals, but a substantial part of the army and its leadership against the Thermidorian and traitorous leaders of the Kremlin. The resistance of the Red Army, or its rebellion against the Central Power, would be all the more justified by the fact that the new course actually configured itself as a kind of twofold state revolution, which, breaking with the Bolshevik October, proceeded arbitrarily to the abolition of the militia and to the restoration of the officers' caste 18 years after the revolutionary abolition. Unquote. According to this view, by eventually rising up against Stalin, the Red Army would have in fact foiled the coup and he had engineered and restored revolutionary legality. As if all this were not enough, the Trotskyist opposition bulletin evokes an imminent army revolt. Perhaps a measure taken in Moscow a few months before the trials was aimed at facing this possible danger. Quote, on the 29th of March 1937, the Politburo issued a resolution mandating retirement or dispatch to civilian work for Red Army officers who had been expelled from the party for political reasons. Unquote. Further fueling the climate of suspicion and concern, rumors were being circulated by White Army Russian circles in Paris about a military coup being prepared in Moscow. Finally, in the second half of January 1937, information reached the Czechoslovak president Eduard Beneš concerning secret negotiations in progress between the Third Reich and the anti-Stalinist clique in the USSR, Marshal Tukhachevsky, Rykov, and others. Unquote. Was there any foundation to the accusation, or was the whole thing made up by the German secret services? Also, in early 1937, conversing with Foreign Minister Konstantin von Neurath, Hitler had rejected the idea of an improvement in relations with the USSR, but added, quote, it would be different if things in Moscow were to develop in a direction of absolute despotism based on the military. In that case, it would not be permissible to waste the opportunity to make our presence felt again in Russia. Beneš had also made the French leadership aware of negotiations, whose confidence in the Franco-Soviet pact were considerably weakened. So it was not only Stalin who gave credence to the rumors or information passed on by the Czechoslovak president. And on the other hand, even after the conclusion of the Second World War, Churchill seems to endorse Moscow's version, pointing out, as we shall see, that the purge had affected the pro-German elements, to which he added, Stalin was conscious of personal debt to President Beneš. Unquote. The question about the rumor remains open, however, and to answer it conclusively, a conversation at Hitler's table in the summer of 1942 is of little help. Though, without referring to the definite military conspiracy, Hitler had observed that Stalin had serious reasons to fear being killed by Tukhachevsky's circle. Had the whole thing been staged under direct supervision or constant of the Führer himself, the latter would perhaps have boasted about it, at a time when the impression of the Wehrmacht's first overwhelming successes was still fresh. After the trial and execution had already taken place, and asking the key question, was there really a military conspiracy? Trotsky forwards an answer that gives pause. Quote, "It all depends on what people call a conspiracy. Every sign of discontent, every time dissatisfied people draw closer together, every criticism or argument about what must be done in order to halt devastating policies of the government is, from Stalin's point of view, a conspiracy. And under a totalitarian regime, without any doubt, every opposition is the embryo of a conspiracy." In this sense, an embryo was the general's aspirations to protect the army from the demoralizing intrigues of the GPU. Is this a refutation of the conspiracy thesis, or its admission in the Aesopian language imposed by circumstances? Drawing attention to this ambiguous statement is the above-mentioned fervent Trotskyist Russian historian, Rogovin, who finally took up Tukhachevsky's thesis of the anti-Stalinist conspiracy and placed it in a Bolshevik rather than a bourgeois political framework. In conclusion, doubts remain, but it seems difficult to explain the whole affair with the usual deus ex machina. The director, thirsty for power and blood, and in any case eager to surround himself only with puppets, ready for blind and unconditional obedience. All the more fragile is this explanation for the fact that in 1932, Stalin had no difficulties in attending, together with Molotov, and listened to the lectures of Boris P. Shapovshinnikov. Jeez, I apologize for butchering that name. The director of the military academy. And from these lectures given by the strategist of great prestige, but one who was not a member of the Communist Party, Stalin seems to have gained greatly. You know the guy I mean. On the other hand, military art was one of the few politically important domains in which Stalin encouraged the original and experimenting mind, quote unquote, so that officers' corps were able to show remarkable independence of mind. The generals who took place of Tukhachevsky and his collaborators were those who, far from being passive executors, expressed their opinions frankly and argued with autonomous judgment, without hesitating to contradict the supreme leader, who, moreover, encouraged and sometimes rewarded this attitude. Three civil wars. If we do not want to remain prisoners of the characterized portraits of Stalin drawn by Trotsky and by Khrushchev, in the course of two different but equally bitter political struggles, we must not lose sight of the fact that the events that began in October 1917 were characterized by three civil wars. The first saw the revolution clashing with the variegated front of its enemies, supported by the capitalist powers, committed to containing the Bolshevik contagion by all means necessary. The second develops from a revolution from above and outside, which, despite some pushes from below, from the peasant world, substantially consists in the collectivization of agriculture. The third is that which tears the Bolshevik ruling group apart. The latter is all the more complex, in having been characterized by great political fluidity, and even by resounding reversals of positions. We have seen Bakunin, on occasion of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, briefly hinting at a project of a sort of coup d'etat against Lenin, who he reproaches for wanting to transform, quote, the party into a dung heap, unquote. But if at that moment Bakunin approached Trotsky's position in the eyes of the latter, Bakunin becomes 10 years later the privileged embodiment of the Thermidor and bureaucratic treachery. With Stalin against Bakunin? Yes. With Bakunin against Stalin? Never. This is a moment when Trotsky seemed to warn Stalin against Bakunin. The latter would soon hunt down Stalin as a Trotskyist, just as Stalin hunted down Zinoviev. It was 1928, and already the rift between Stalin and Bakunin were emerging. In fact, because of the abandonment of the NEP, Bakunin began describing Stalin privately as the representative of neo-Trotskyism and as an unprincipled integer. Ultimately, as the worst and most dangerous enemy within the party. The former diarchy thus set out on the path that would lead him to form a bloc with Trotsky. In the end, the various oppositions united against the vector. Hence, the fact remains that to the very end, the sides in the daily conflict among the Bolsheviks were rather mutable. Fought in a country with no liberal tradition, and characterized on the one hand by the prolongation of the state of exception, and on the other hand by the persistence of an ideology inclined to dismiss as merely formal the norms governing the rule of law. The Third Civil War takes on the ferocity of a religious war. Trotsky, who considered himself the only man fit to be the leader of the revolution, was inclined to resort to any means to bring down the false messiah from the usurped throne. A zealous faith also inspires the opposing camp. The more determined Stalin was to stamp out any danger of conspiracy, even the remotest kind, the more the clouds of war threatened the very existence of Russia itself, and the country of socialism, therefore posing a mortal danger to both national and social causes, the two causes which Stalin was convinced he embodied. Not always easily distinguishable from each other, acts of terrorism and sabotage can reflect either counter-revolutionary or new revolutionary projects. The three civil wars were in turn intertwined with the intervention of this or that great power. The entanglement and tragic whole of these conflicts dissolved in the depictions drawn in different ways, first by Trotsky and then by Khrushchev, who told simple and edifying fables of a monster who by his mere touch turns gold into blood and slime. That brings us to the end of chapter 2.